Welcome to this fifth lecture in the diversity series of lectures arranged by the Indian Academy of Sciences, the Academic Trust in association with the Council for National Science Museums. My name is Tirthankar Bhattacharya. I happen to be the chairperson of the Outreach Committee of the Academic Trust, and today I have the very pleasant duty of introducing Professor Ganesh Narendas Devi, was born in 1950. He's a literary critic and former professor. He worked in Baroda University for a very long time, and he has held fellowships in the University of Leeds as well as at Yale University. But most interestingly, he kind of quit formal academics to work among Adivasis. He heads now an organization involving 3,000 people who work among Adivasis. Just for the sake of information, maybe I should mention certain awards and honors that have come his way, but his work goes much beyond that which can be captured by these awards. He received a Padma Shri in 2014. He's a Sahitya Academy Award winner of 1993. Apart from that, the SARC Literary Award in 2001, Prince Claus Award in 2003, and a Lingua Pax Prize. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly. Probably it's in some other language. A Lingua Pax Prize in 2011. The Professor Devi writes in English, Marathi, and Gujarati. He lives in Gujarat. His Marathi and Gujarati books have received high acclaim, as well as his English book. But he speaks, other than these and Hindi, he speaks about a dozen Adivasi languages. He has chosen to work among the Adivasis. Today we are honored to have him with us to tell us about the linguistic diversity in India. Professor Devi.
I feel absolutely honored in being asked by this fabled Institute of Science and your legendary group of scientists and scholars. I've been asked to speak about linguistic diversity in India. At the outset, I should make it clear that one cannot think of linguistic diversity the same way as one thinks of life diversity, plant diversity, species diversity, and so on, for the simple reason that language is not an organic system. It is not a life system. It is a system of science made by humans. And even if in our colloquial manner we say that a language is born or a language dies, the birth or the death of a language cannot just be compared with the birth and death of an animal or a plant. And so, while thinking of language, we have to think of the diversity slightly differently. And in thinking of that with a difference, we have to think of the engagement of language in the human society and its place in the human evolution. Philosophers have debated for centuries, for ages, if the human consciousness is a fact, a reality, or a delusion, there being no conclusive proof of one's consciousness being there apart from all other organs and functions of the body. Similarly, philosophers also questioned if the phenomenal reality, the reality outside the human consciousness, is actually there or whether it is a limited perception of what is there or what is not there by the human mind. But despite these two great uncertainties, what is certain is that language is the only bridge that connects the human consciousness with the world outside, with the phenomenal world. And this bridging of the mind or the consciousness with the world outside has been a major turning point in the story of the evolution of species. The rise of the Homo sapien from its previous stage, or I would rather say the rise of various man-like, human-like species, whether it's Neanderthal or the Homo erectus or the Homo sapien, as against the earlier, the preceding animal from where these arise, is marked by the ability of humans to control and manage voice, sound, output of air, and turning those into some kind of symbols for communication. No doubt in the initial stages, the range of signs that humans could muster was necessarily limited. For a very long time, these sounds were monosyllabic, as in bird calls or as in animal cries. But slowly, over time, these monosyllables were woven together and made into multi-syllabic signaling system. It is believed that humans spread out of Africa to other continents, and that movement out of Africa is dated roughly 75,000 years before our time. Evolutionary sciences also tell us that around 45,000 years before our time, a second wave of migration had started. But between the first wave and the second wave, the members of this species who had spread out to what we call now the Middle East or even the Far East or South Asia and even to Australia, they tended to settle particularly at places where there was plenty of food available, animals to hunt, and enough of water for their survival. And as a result, those humans of ancient times had developed what ethnographers call population knots. It is these population knots dispersed, placed at far distances. These population knots created the earliest layer of human languages. Therefore, friends, the theory that all human languages originate from a single language, or at least most languages in a continent come from a single language, is not scientifically accurate. There were in ancient world many languages spread out, partly in the Slavic, what is today called the Slavic world, partly in the Iranian world, partly in South Asia, also Australia, and a small group had reached from the eastern side, Russia, to what is now the North American continent. Therefore, the history of human languages stretches to 45,000 years. And the very beginning of that history is with diversity of the signaling systems. However, because of climate changes, because of the onset of the Pleistocene, the cold era, till the beginning of the Holocene, that's roughly 9,500 years before Christ, that's about 11 and a half millennia before our time, the languages developed also disappeared. And it was when the Holocene brought in the possibility of slightly warmer climate and therefore the growth of species and hence availability of food in adequate measure, that the languages that we know them today as languages started developing. So we have knowledge about human languages over the last 11,000 years. And during these 11,000 years, human languages have gained an exceptional feature which probably did not exist in language prior to that date. And that feature is the ability to conceptualize time. Because one does not know if time exists or whether what exists as time tallies with the human perception of that time. But human languages conceptualize time, and with that conceptual handle, human languages created the use of the past and, as a reflection, the use of the future. And that made human languages three-dimensional. That also made human languages the most convenient, the most suitable vehicle for deposition of sensory perception or knowledge that humans gained out of senses, sensory perceptions. And so, with the help of language, a transgenerational transaction of what we probably can call knowledge began. How many languages were there at that time, some 11,000 years before our time? We do not know. There were attempts made to count the number of human languages in different parts of the world in different historical phases. But since writing did not evolve well until about 5,000 years before Christ, we just do not have a record of that count. The record of languages in the world that we have is only from the times of the Egyptian civilization. And there too, because several of those languages have still remained undeciphered, we do not know enough about that entire record. For instance, we know that the Harappan language is still not finally decoded, and probably the possibility of it getting decoded any soon is quite dim. So there are those lost languages. But more recently, and that's about 2,500 years before our time, in India, Panini had done a fair amount of count of languages, a survey of languages that existed at his time. And on the basis of that knowledge, he produced a system of thinking about those languages, which today we call grammar. Panini's was not the grammar of a given language, but it was a system of grammar that could be applied to practically any language that existed in his times. After Panini, that's 4th century before Christ, we have sometime in the 5th or 6th century a very strange character in our history, intellectual history. His name is Matanga. He's associated more with music. He tried to study the musical potential of each and every language in India and produce a tome called the Brihad Desi. Of course, Matanga's Brihad Deshi or Panini's grammatical system Ashtadhyayi won't be accepted today by any surveyor of languages. The last, the more acceptable survey was carried out by George Grierson, and that was from the last decade of the 19th century to the third decade of the 20th century. He took about 30 odd years in doing his survey. And in that, he found out that there were 189 languages and 544 dialects. Now, this dialect language is an issue for which there is no conclusive answer still. What is a dialect today can be language tomorrow. Oriya was considered as a dialect of Bangla for a very long time. Konkani was considered as a dialect of Marathi for a very long time. Today, Konkani is a proper scheduled language with literature of its own. Oriya is not just a proper scheduled language, but even is recognized as a classical language by the government of India. Of course, we knew that we are a multilingual nation, but we did not have a clear idea of that multilingualism. Grierson gave us a fair degree of awareness of how multilingual we are. And therefore, when India was looking forward to becoming an independent nation, our leaders started thinking about how India could be run with so many languages around. Since the model of nationalism that India had chosen was not the model that Germany or Italy had proposed, but rather the model that Ireland, France, and the United States had proposed. Fortunately for us, the makers of the Constitution agreed to accommodate a large number of languages. When the Constituent Assembly was set up, there was debate on the language question in practically every meeting of the Constituent Assembly. Perhaps the only meeting in which the issue did not crop up was the first meeting, which was meant for welcoming the members of the Constituent Assembly. And because those debates did not arrive at any definite conclusion, instead of becoming articles in the Constitution, the language issue became a schedule in the Constitution, which is the 8th schedule of the Constitution. When we adopted the Constitution, the 8th schedule had a list of 14 languages. Today, the 8th schedule has 22 languages listed in it. Now, one single criterion was accepted for inclusion of a language in the 8th schedule, and that criterion was that a language, in order to be part of the 8th schedule, has to have literature of its own, and particularly printed literature. Now, when printing came to India, not every language got into print. Some languages were printed in Calcutta's government printing press, but not all of the languages got printed. And therefore, many languages which deserve to be included in the 8th schedule remain outside the schedule. Soon after the Constitution was accepted, adopted, we moved in the direction of setting up linguistic states. It was in the 1950s that the Commission for Reorganization of Linguistic Reorganization of States was set up. And throughout that decade, very violent protests had been taking place in Telangana, in Punjab, in Maharashtra, and under that pressure, to the year 1965, the government of India at that time created different linguistic states. The result was that while many languages which were part of the 8th schedule got their states, their own states, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh for Telugu, Tamil Nadu for Tamil, Maharashtra for Marathi, Punjab for Punjabi, and so on. Many languages that were not part of the 8th schedule, despite being spoken by large numbers, got segmented. For instance, the Bili language, which at that time was spoken by over 1 crore people, got distributed among Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. The same happened to Undi. Same was the fate of Santali, Munda, and many other languages. Besides, the languages of certain princely states received less attention than they deserve. And as a result, neither Kutchi in Gujarat, nor Tulu in Karnataka, nor Ahirani in Maharashtra, nor Khasi and Garo in today's Meghalaya got the status, though they deserved the status, as scheduled languages. In 1961, we had several scheduled languages and many more non-scheduled languages. And if we look at the census of 1961, we notice that the list of mother tongues in 1961 census brought the number to 1,652 mother tongues claimed by the people of India. In 1971, this method was changed. The data of the census was disclosed not in the year 71, but in the year 78. And in those intervening years, Bangladesh had become an independent nation on the question of language. And therefore, the government of India decided to introduce an imaginary cutoff point. This imaginary cutoff point was of 10,000. If a language is claimed by more than 10,000 persons, which is not a scientific criterion, but this was a bureaucratic criterion. If a language is spoken by more than 10,000, then its name can be included in the list of language names announced by the census. In 1971, the list was brought down from 1652 of the previous census to only 108. There was a 109th element in that list, but that item read all others. Friends, since 1971, these all others, or nearly 1,500 odd languages, have become the lost languages of India. United Nations had started in 1990s a mission to list the endangered languages of the world. And in that list, a large number of Indian languages were included, particularly languages from the Himalayan states. The Himalayan states have, because of their typical geography, languages spoken by very small numbers, but a large number of languages. In Arunachal Pradesh, more than 200 languages are noticed, but not any of those 200 is spoken by more than 1 lakh. Most of them are spoken by only a few hundred. The UNESCO decided in the second edition of this list of endangered languages that a state's deliberate negligence of a language amounts to a genocide. The reason was that the economic development of people, if not woven together with the language ecology, those people suffer in the competitive developmental uh, 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 metrics, or the languages are lost altogether. So either they are economic losers or they are cultural losers, and in most cases they're losers both ways. When I did the linguistic survey of India with this team of 3,000 that was mentioned, I noticed that there were 780 languages that my team could count. And there were about 80 others that my team wanted to, but could not for a variety of reasons. So about 850 languages. In comparison to 1961, these figures tell me that in those 50 years, 1961 to 2011, more than 250 Indian languages perished. Now, please remember, even if a language is small, every word has a history of labor, intellectual labor as well as physical labor, which stretches over several hundred years. In 2010, the last speaker of the Bo language in Andaman died. This was a lady 85 years in age, and during her very last day, she was speaking only to birds because nobody else understood a language. When Bo in 2010, a language that was alive for 60,000 years disappeared with her. When I was doing a survey, I came across a language called Mazi in Sikkim. There are about 4 speakers at that time, but none of them is alive today. When a language dies, an entire worldview dies, because a language is a unique way of looking at space and time, and no other language can look at the same space and same time in the same identical manner. Language diversity often is considered as a burden for the state, because many people think simplistically that a nation should have a single language. But please remember that the idea of nation has come much more recently in human history, whereas language has been with us from the time we became humans. And there is absolutely no scientific basis for believing that a nation must have a single language. That will reduce the diversity, and that will also reduce the imaginative life of the people. It will take away the people's freedom to use expression in the way they want to use it. Today, all over the world, it is believed there are about 7,000 languages. The highest number was believed to have existed in Papua New Guinea. The next in strength came Indonesia and then India. The number of languages dying in India is, if not higher than the number of languages dying in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, certainly equal to that number. And if this situation continues, India would be linguistically much the poorer country in the times to come. Can India sustain so many languages and manage to educate children in so many languages? Will those children be good schoolers, good academics? Will they be intellectually sufficiently productive? These questions have been asked and answered very adequately by scientists working in the area of cognitive sciences as well as education. And the answer is very clear and loud, and it is that If a child lives in a multilingual social context, family context, the child's cognitive performance is far superior to a child living in monolingual family context or social context. Therefore, multilingualism is an enhancement of the human cognitive ability. And therefore, in many countries, while those countries are monolingual, classrooms are deliberately introducing multilingual schooling. In India, we are already gifted with multilingualism, and all that we have to do is to preserve it. There is a second problem which is facing not just Indian languages and India as a nation, but the entire world. And that problem comes from the fact that in the process of its evolution, the human brain seems to have developed a certain degree of fatigue in the area known as the Broca's lobe, which is the area of the brain taking care of language transactions, of reduction of meaning, abstraction, and making judgments. Scholars devoted to studying reading habits have come to the conclusion, after sufficient number of laboratory experiments, that children in future would want to communicate not through language based on sound, but language based on signs. Not sound, but visual signals. And if that transition takes place as it is feared will take place, probably humans might move out of the language phase altogether and move on to or move into a new phase of communication. There is obviously a limitation to the medium that language uses, and that medium is nothing but thin air and making waves in that thin air that we call sound. And sound has its limited capability of traveling distance, whereas the digital signals can travel much further, much faster, and also beyond and outside the uh, the uh, the universe of the earth. So possibly, if humans are looking in future at a multi-planetary existence, the sound-based language may not be good enough for them, and therefore there appears to be a rush towards moving into digits, moving towards digits, and moving towards a system of signs which will be useful for long distance communication. If that happens, then languages as we know them today will undergo a transformation. If that happens, we will revisit that moment in history that occurred when we moved from Pleistocene to Holocene. If that happens, all that we have accumulated through language as knowledge may get transformed altogether. I should add something about this question of accumulation of knowledge through language. Historians of memory have said that when humans acquired knowledge, when humans acquired language, they started passing on their sensory perceptions, their knowledge stock, their experience of life from one generation to the next generation. And when this deposit, this stock of such collective memory increase, humans invented ways of remembering huge chunks of things through certain small clues. So these tricks were called mnemonics, memory tricks. And when these memory tricks also multiplied, they acquired the shape of disciplines. And that's how in the initial phase of scientific development, maybe in the 17th century in Europe, there were different kinds of taxonomies and different kinds of tables used, say for instance, in chemistry or in geology or in plant sciences or animal sciences. All of this, all of these were brought together under a single matrix of the universal memory by using the strings of 0101. Leibniz was the man who figured out how that could be done, and it was as a result of that access through a secondary system of remembering universal knowledge. The universal knowledge was knowledge in which one can have access to what is accumulated as knowledge universally. But this invention also led to the human creation of artificial memory. And the memory chip, which has now become very active in our life, has started overwhelming the human mind, the human society. The memory chip has started challenging the natural memory of humans. And since human memory is an essential ingredient in the architecture of language in terms of its past tense, in terms of its future tense, if the human memory is replaced by artificial memory, we probably might have to see the end of language pretty soon. Ladies and gentlemen, in short, what I said is, if we get into an accentuated nationalism, there's a risk for language diversity. If we get into an adventurous idea of development leading to a multi-planetary existence, there is a risk to language. And if we move further in our dependence on artificial memory, then there is certainly a great threat to language. And if language disappears, all that we have accumulated as experience of thousands of years also stands the risk of going away or going west. And if that happens, we may probably return to the state of being an animal that we were in the past. Therefore, language diversity matters. Even if it is not an organic system, even if it is man-made, it matters a lot, because just as humans made language, language made us humans from being just animals. Therefore, language diversity matters a lot to each one of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Devi. That was an enjoyable talk. I learned a lot. Maybe you can keep your video on, and will you be willing to take some questions?
Yes, with pleasure.
I learned a lot. I liked when you said that nation is a very recent concept, and languages have been with us ever since we started civilization, from the beginning of our existence, so to say. That is something very deep. I appreciate that.
Well, let me give an example. We say in Hindi, "Arey yaar kaise hai?" Now, this array is intimate pronoun. I mean, instead of I, you, we, he, she, it, we use array as intimate pronoun. This has gone from Dravidic languages, Proto-Dravidic, ancient Tamil, to all the way to Iran, and it has returned to us from Iran through Persian. Now, this simple word array does not know national boundaries. It does not understand South India or West Asia. There's so many such words that we use. These words have traveled many countries and have come to rest here. Bataka, potato, is a great example, which we use in everyday food, but it has come from another continent, another world. Practically every word, uh, almost every word, has made rounds of the universe and have come to rest here in our own languages.
Yeah, I mean, that's not surprising. I have noticed this in my own travel as well. There are many common words between several Slavic languages and North Indian languages. Yeah. Um, I was wondering whether you would comment on the Harappan civilization and whether they actually migrated along the west coast or going by North India and then along the east coast to Tamil Nadu, for example. Both of these are, I mean, Harappan language is still undeciphered, and Tamil is a very old language. And of course, I'm nowhere near an expert on these things, but from various writings, I read that there are similarities between them.
Well, the Harappans, the Harappan civilization is dated as of now at 2400 before Christ to 1900 before Christ. That's 4,500 years before our time. But there is of course a layer of civilization that preceded that mature culmination of the Harappan civilization, and that goes maybe for about 1,000 years before that particular phase. And during that phase, there was a lot of exchange between what is today Iran and what is today, I mean, the Harappan sites. Harappan sites are found in extensive geographical area. There was also trade and exchange of goods between the Dravidic, the people we now recognize as Dravidian people, and those people. There was a third trade route, and that was from Central Asia to the area that is now Sindh and so on. So there was a coastal route, and there were at least two land routes. But one thing is certain, that the Harappans did not have horses with them. They had bulls, but not horses. And they had dogs. I mean, the oldest domesticated animal in human history is dog, and then comes bull or cow, and then comes horse. And there are fascinating histories of horse keeping, horse breeding, and so on. And all those histories go to show that people who developed the skill of throwing arrows standing atop a horse-driven cart, which we can call ratha, had a superiority in warfare, and it was their language that spread to faster than languages that used to spread earlier in human history. And that phase came some 400 years before the mature Harappan phase was over. So we have the Rigvedas coming from the language brought in by these people. And the gap between the end of Harappa and the rise of Rigveda is still a mystery for us. The clues to that particular phase is in the Gandhar culture or the Afghan culture. I mean, we have in Indian music, for instance, in Sare Ga Ma, Ga is a voice control system that we describe as Gandhar.
Yes, Sadadrisa Gandhar, yes.
But we need new equipment to actually figure out the phonetics of that G management in Indian music styles and Afghan music styles, and then get to the grammar of the language, and then through comparative study of terms used between these two cultures, we can reconstruct the Proto-Pakhtuni or the Proto languages of the eastern side of the eastern part of Afghanistan. But we are not come to that. We need some more. Genetics has helped us a lot in reconstruction of linguistic migration histories.
Yeah.
Plant histories, particularly the seeds and so on, they have also helped. Study of teeth, ancient teeth in the skeletons, that has helped. But we still have to develop in two directions. One is the evolution of the, uh, the physiognomy of the throat, and because none of the organs that we use for speaking were meant for speech, neither teeth nor lips nor the tongue nor nose. Uh,
Mhm.
I think some more light on how the human organs have developed over time. That is one, and the other is micro assessment of tones and tunes. We need far more sophisticated equipment to do that study, and then we'll be able to reconstruct the entire history of human languages accurately. Till then, since I think every scientific gap is a breeding ground for ideologues, and since we do not know enough about what happened between the Harappan period, end of Harappan period, and the rise of Rigveda, people will keep combating and conflicting regarding whether we came from there or here, or and they will have heyday for spreading myth in place of scientific.
Yeah, I think there are some questions. Maitri B asks, how does a language die? Aren't there always speakers in the same tribe who speak to each other?
The languages die in two ways. One is the mega, and the other is the micro. The small languages die when people in that language are denied development possibilities. They migrate to another language zone. For instance, the coastal people in India, since the laws related to fishing have changed, and small time fishing has gone out now, and it is big sea farming. Laws are favorable to that. Therefore, communities that engage traditionally in the fishing or depended on fishing, sea agriculture, they have migrated inland, leaving their languages and adopting new languages. When I knew a community called Kharwa in North Maharashtra and southern Gujarat coastal area, and I had seen that at least 5 lakh of them came together on one specific time of the year for a week for fixing marriages. They used to decide their marriages only during that jatra. But today, I don't see those many. I don't see more than 2 to 3,000 coming together there.
Mhm.
So Kharwa languages has gone or is about to go. It will die. But the mega languages die for a completely different reason. And that reason is every language has its peculiar carrying capacity. Semantic load carried by a language. If, if a language becomes overambitious, and the semantic load increases, a language starts cracking, it develops, it gets fragmented. The best example of this is Latin language. I mean, Latin had a huge empire, and it was at one time hungry to eat all the other languages that Latin itself called the vernaculars, the barbaric languages. But history tells us that it is the barbaric languages and the vernacular, such as Italian, French, Spanish, they developed and Latin went down. The same happened with the Sanskrit language. At one time, it was seen as superior to the Prakruts, but it is the Rajasthani Prakrut, the Gujarati Prakrut, the Maharashtrian Prakrut, the Paishachik, and so on, which came up as Bangla, as Oriya, as Kashmiri, as Marathi, as Gujarati. The carrying capacity of a language cannot be exceeded by a language. Just as I do not understand physics, but I would like to imagine that a certain matter, if it travels beyond its own ability to travel, might just get fragmented into small particles. I don't understand physics, but I'm trying to imagine an example to make my point related to language. So mega languages die because of their hunger, their appetite, their avarice, their greed to speak more, say more, contain more, and small languages die because of the hunger of the people who speak those languages.
That's an immunity answer.
Like buffaloes die, and I mean, we cannot bring a life-saving drug for a language or a doctor on call. Languages disappear. They disappear. They fall out of use. Languages go like old umbrellas, out of use.
That's a good analogy. I think Sumit Yadav asks, sir, would we ever be able to decipher the languages that haven't been understood yet?
Well, languages that were used in the past and are being deciphered, not all of them have been fully deciphered. In the case of the Harappan script, by the way, in the case of Harappa, nobody's talking of the Harappan language. Everybody's talking about the Harappan script. And I would like to remind myself that a script is not a language. A script is photograph of a language, and not a language. In fact, many languages have used more than one script in their history. Sanskrit has used Devanagari, Sharda, Modi. In Kerala, Sanskrit was written in Malayalam script, and in Karnataka it was written in Kannada script in so many inscriptions. English, which is a great language, does not have a script even today, a script of its own. It is using the Roman script, modified Roman script. So a script is not a language. What we have been studying in the case of Harappa is the Harappan script, in the hope that by studying that script, we might get to know what kind of language the Harappan people use. But since the seals found have two types of debates associated with them. The first debate is whether the seals were actually letters, as we understand letters in a script, or whether they were status markers. Just as we have, on the shoulder of a soldier, those ribbons. It is still not decided whether the seals found, because the seals were not like the inscriptions. They were found in different dwellings and they brought together. The second debate is that there is not, even if the number of seals found is very large, they're not enough in number to come up with a flawless matching of their potential significance. And because of these two difficulties, the Harappan script is not deciphered. As a result, in more recent time, historians have taken a different route to the Harappan language, and that is through oral traditions. The oral traditions of Rajasthan and Sindh are being investigated in a very big way. Several new epics have been found in on the border of Rajasthan and Gujarat, for instance, western Gujarat and Rajasthan, and that is there are 4 epics in the Garasia language, and people are trying to go back through the myths in those epics to the Harappan past. Because surely the Harappan people just did not evaporate in thin air. They remained there. Many of the Harappan things have remained with us. For instance, lota, which is lota as a shape, is a Harappan invention. Or swastika was found in Harappa. But Harappa did not show presence of a public god. There was no place of worship in Harappa. Though there are occasional figurines found resembling the linga and so on, and it is still not decided whether Shiva was a Harappan deity or not. Undeciphered languages cannot be deciphered in every case. In some cases, they can be deciphered. There are also, just as there are languages of the past that have not been deciphered, there are languages of the present which cannot be analyzed. There is a very unique case of in Maharashtra's Buldhana district. There's a language spoken only in 3 talukas. It is called Nihali. And no linguist in the world has been able to place Nihali into any language family. I mean, it's like saying that there is a plant, but it does not belong to any of the plant, classifications that we learned. And so Nihali is a very unique language. People just do not know, linguists just do not know how to deal with it. There are now about 1800 speakers still left. And it is likely that the Nihali speakers have their tradition going back to, if you have been to Madhya Pradesh, a place called Bhimbetka, where there are paintings in the caves which are dated at about 30,000 years before our time. So probably Nihali is the kind of language that people living in the Bhimbetka caves spoke. If we get to know something more about Nihali, I'm trying to study that language now. If we get to know enough about that language and its past, we might be able to find some co-terminal roots to understanding the Harappan language. So there are many parts in the world which still call for greater archaeological and prehistorical studies. And once we have done those studies, we will be able to speak about all languages of all time. The only sad thing is, by then probably humans may not have any language left, as I was saying.
Yeah, that was another revelation to know that we might progress to sign language.
We are moving into the world of silence, a soundless world. Not there will be, of course, natural sounds in nature, but sounds created by you. I mean, language sounds created by humans. As you know, sir, silence is one of the cutting edge industries in the 21st century. People are engaged in a big way in producing and selling silence. And I mean, we need no linguist to tell us that in a family, just your family, my family, people are no longer speaking. They're only looking at their mobile screens all the time. Whether it is a classroom or a workplace or family space, it is through silence that we're communicating. Because the communication through mobile or internet is not a voiced communication. It is a voiceless communication. It has a hint of voice. We imagine somebody speaking that, but actually nobody spoken that. These are only digital signals. And so we might move into a symbolic system which is bereft of voice, and maybe it will have gained something. It will have additional features which will make it more competent in some other ways.
Maybe.
But it will be the language with which we have shouted at each other and fought with each other and fallen in love with each other. It won't be the language of the same kind of human emotional cosmos. It will be language. That language of future will be the language either of Homo Deus or chip, half brain animal, which is not exactly the Homo sapien, but a different species altogether, a non-organic or semi-organic species that humans finally create as a revenge on the imagined god.
Yeah, I wonder what will happen to music then. I mean, that may be the greatest loss if we move away from language.
It will, it will be. Well, every gain has as its flip
Some
side.
loss. So Sumit Yadav asks, how exactly can we preserve a language?
If language can be woven into development plans, then the areas where small number of speakers speak a particular language, for instance, the Asur language in on the border of West Bengal and Bihar, a very small number speak that language. If a language, if language is woven into development plans, then those development plans will pay special attention to livelihood creation for small language communities, and that will help us in preserving languages. And if we preserve more languages, probably India might become economically the most attractive place on earth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, Namita Timaya, can the government help in any way to save these languages which don't have scripts?
It's a good question, but my answer may not match the goodness in that question. Still, I will venture to give it. When I completed the People's Linguistic Survey of India, I had done it as a non-governmental activity. I was called by the then education minister, and after listening to what that survey contained and looking at all those volumes, the minister asked me what the government could do for me or my survey. So I said with folded hands to him, "Sir, please do nothing." He kept his word, and that helped me in completing the survey without any hindrance. Languages were never created by governments, and the governments cannot keep languages alive. It is the most democratic system. Languages are made by people. People use them. Till today, speaking a language does not cost us anything. I think it is people's efforts that will keep languages alive. Now, so often this question comes: can the government teach some language in school or so on? My answer to that is all historical experience of humans in the past shows that people will continue to use a language if it is of use to them, irrespective of the fact if it's taught in a school or not taught in a school. I mean, my friend Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, uh, studied Latin in high school, but wrote in English. Chaucer studied in times when French was the national language of England, but still he produced good English literature. So I'm saying that school language teaching, actually it's a redundant activity, quite frankly, if you look at it rationally. By the time the child's brain from the age of 8th month to the 18th month already figures out how to distinguish between the self and the other. And so the child understands how language can be used by distinguishing me from them and trying to bridge the gap. The child, and by the time a child is 3.5 years old, the child has a full command over complex linguistic structures. What the school teaches a child is how to write what the child speaks. But this language education was introduced in the education system in the middle of the 19th century. In 1840s, there were riots in Britain because of a movement called the Chartist movement. This Chartist movement was called Chartist movement because people had prepared a charter of demand. The demand was equal days wages for equal days labor. People had to work for 14 hours but were not paid enough. And as a sweet punishment, as a reformatory punishment to those rebelling children, laborers, the British government decided to teach English in school. Till then, only dead languages were taught in schools. So, for instance, Greek and Latin were taught in British schools. In India, traditional schools, whatever they were prior to the colonial times, used to teach Sanskrit, which was a dead language at that time. So only the languages which were distant, classical languages which had valuable literature in them, they were taught in schools. But teaching a contemporary language in a school is a bit of a joke. And since the entire world has accepted that joke as is in a serious way, we are not free to laugh at that joke. Otherwise, it's a redundant activity to teach a child after the age of 3.5 to speak, to use the language which the child has already picked up from home. Thank you.
That's an interesting point of view. Okay, I have a question in regard to that, but let's ask first the things that others are asking. Sumit Yadav asks, are there still new languages being formed?
Yes. Every day. The first thing is new scripts new scripts in India. I counted 64 new scripts have come up in the last 50 years. They're used by tribals in most cases. Santali, which began with 2 scripts, evolved 6 more scripts subsequently and has now an accumulation of 8 scripts for. Similarly, Kokbarak in Tripura, there were script riots and lot of bloodshed. Initially, somebody wanted it to be written in Roman, then somebody wanted it to be written in Bangla script, somebody wanted it to be written using Devanagari. So the Bru language has now come up with its own script. 64 new scripts have come up and made popular in their specific areas all over the country. New languages, the sign language now, sign language use that we use in the schools run for deaf children. They are now identified, and there are 8 distinct sign languages that have been developed in India by the people, but they were never recognized as languages. Today they are recognized as languages. Similarly, if we look at the universe of the Hindi language, you will see in the census data that nearly 65 other languages are subsumed in Hindi, and some of them are dying and some are growing. Among the most enthusiastically growing language, energetically growing language is Bhojpuri. Bhojpuri was claimed by more than 5 crores in the last census as their mother tongue. And Bhojpuri has gained many domains of language, such as its music, its theater, its journalism, its television, its market use, and its so many sub-registers and slangs. So new languages do develop. New languages develop when people migrate. They are coming up. Interestingly, I have a friend in New Zealand and a friend in Ireland, and when 3 of us come together, I notice that I understand to some extent what the New Zealander says in English, and I understand to a much larger extent what the Irish person says in English, but an Irish and a New Zealander user of English find each other's speech mutually unintelligible. So they're bound to become new languages. The New Zealandish and the Irish English might become Englishes.
Mm.
In India, we have developed Hinglish. So yes, new languages. So long as humans are there, humans are extremely inventive, and they will keep inventing new words, new languages, and the same language also undergoes such drastic transformation sometimes. We do not recognize our own language as it was spoken 300 years ago as our language. There's a very interesting case of Marathi spoken in Tamil Nadu by people who migrated to Tamil Nadu in the 17th century. And though I speak Marathi, when I listen to that Marathi, I find it very quaint.
Yeah, I have noticed this thing in my travels as well. In South Africa, they still use the word brinjal, which we learned as a kid. None of my British or American friends understood what brinjal is.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Happens. Tausif asks, is the attitude of the speaker also responsible for the decay of a language?
Well, self-respect for a language keeps a language going. But if self-respect turns into excessive pride, that hurts a language. Because this excessive pride generates the idea of standard language and dialect. We have all seen My Fair Lady, and we know how a perfectly good language is branded as substandard dialect. So the attitude of the speaker does matter, and it has to be of dignified respect rather than over pride, excessive pride. Otherwise, मी Marathi माणूस might in the end be disastrous for the Marathi language.
Yeah, excessive pride.
I think if there's respect for diversity, and there's also respect for language diversity, humans will be happier far than they are.
Yeah, I mean, we need to remind ourselves that every day, I guess, in these times. Yes. Jai Shankar asks, recent news on links/similarities between Tamil and Harappan. Your inputs on Tamil being the oldest?
Well, the last research on this side was by an archaeologist called Mahadevan, and he showed links between Tamil, Brahmi, and the Harappan. But so far we do not have the very last word on the nature of the Harappan script. And as I said earlier, our research has been about Harappan script and not so much about Harappan language. Because by any stretch of imagination, to think that the entire Harappan civilization had a single language would be a great mistake. It was such an extensive area, there are bound to be a number of languages, maybe related languages, spoken in that civilization. And without obviously, unless they had very active languages, they would not have been able to define the shape of a brick or the length of a wall. So they had words related to geometry, arithmetic, counting, weights, the texture, the brittleness or the toughness of material, tensile strength, of everything. And they were growing crops, so they knew about, they had words related to agriculture. But whether these were the same words used in, let's say, the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, or in Kutch, that's a question that has not been seriously raised or answered. one can speak of the Harappan system of languages, and we will eventually get there, but it will take time.
Yeah. Hemant asks, share your views on the origin and age of Sanskrit.
Well, it was a hypothesis proposed by William Jones towards the end of the 18th century that the ancient forms of Greek, of Latin, of Persian, and Sanskrit were interrelated. This was a hypothesis proposed by a young man. William Jones was 24-year-old when he proposed it. And in search of this ancient common language, linguists spent about 8 decades following William Jones. And by about 1860, they had formulated a theory which was at that time seen as scientific theory, but 60 years later came to be seen as a devilish mistake by the human mind. The 1860s theory was that there were people called Aryans who migrated, and with them they brought a language, either from, it doesn't matter from whether they migrated from north to south or south to north. There is a debate about that. But the northerners think they migrated north to south. The southerners like us think they migrated from south to north. That's the question of national pride. I'll set it aside for the moment. But this theory then further developed into imagining that there were people called Aryans. It was name of a language. Like Professor Bhattacharya gave an example of brinjal. So brinjal growers are not brinjal people, they're brinjal growers. So there were people called Aryans. This was a belief that got firmed up in the 1860s. And by 1920, a political philosophy had emerged around that. And that political philosophy is known by the name fascism of Adolf Hitler, which believed that Aryans were a superior race and all other races were inferior, and therefore the inferior races could actually be dominated by the superior race or could be liquidated altogether. Completely disastrous, devilish, non-scientific theory. Now, in this atmosphere of non-scientific investigations associated with the imagined history of Sanskrit, we have not been able to do proper study of the past of Sanskrit till today. But the fact is that some of the Indian scholars, for instance, Maheshwar Niyog in Assam, who was a great scholar, but who remained neglected in the rest of India because he wrote entirely in Assamese, he came up with the theory of a Proto-Assamese, which is an ancestor of Eastern languages, Oriya, Bangla, Assamese, and that predates Sanskrit. Similarly, we know for sure that Gautam Buddha had great things to say, complex things to say. And for saying complex things, you need a complex language, a well-developed language. And that Buddha said those things in what is recognized as Pali. So Pali is not a single language. Pali is again a set of languages. But that was happening some 500, 600 years before Christ. Similarly, we know that the Jains have texts dating from about 4th century before Christ, and these texts are available, and these texts were written in Prakrit, which means writing had developed in Prakrit, language had developed in Prakrit, which means there was a Proto-Prakrit. So we have this Proto-Prakrit possibility with some historical evidence. We have Proto-Pali possibility with good historical evidence. We have Proto-Assamese possibility, which is still a hypothesis. And we have the Proto-Dravidian hypothesis. So if all these protos are imagined, then all of these rise above, in historical terms, Sanskrit. So Sanskrit, in the context of these four protos, would be late arrival in India. But the influence of Sanskrit on these other languages does not bear out that late arrival theory as well. On the other side, Sanskrit does not quite tie up with the Harappan language, whatever that language was. So we still have a dark period of about 400 years, and as that is 1900 before Christ to 1500 before Christ, those 400 years. I said earlier, maybe I said it rather hurriedly, that we need advanced techniques to study the sound patterns, micro study of those sound patterns we need for the earliest layer of Sanskrit words, which till today people say have come from Avesta, Zend Avesta. But that is once again a theory in absence of a competing theory. So we need to focus on these areas and restructure, reconstruct the past of India on the basis of science and evidence and logic, and not on the basis of myth and belief and faith. Thank you.
I think I will. So I'll ask the question that I had in mind when you said that after a child learns the mother tongue till about 3 or 3.5 years old child, after that there is no need to teach it at school. Um, I consider myself fortunate that I was taught Bangla at school. I didn't go to an English medium school. And I didn't quite like Bangla at that time studying at school because one had to write answers. But then I think that greatly helped me in later years to keep touch with the literature and all that. So my question is, if language is not taught at school, will not, for example, the Bangla department at Kolkata University close down? Because how do you produce academics unless it is taught from that stage? Maybe it's a naive question.
In the history of language over the last maybe 70,000, I will not say 70,000, say let's say last 10,000 years, school as a system emerged much later.
Yes.
The earliest records of schools in Europe are the Lyceum in Italy, the Latin world, or the Greek gymnasiums. And their rhetoric was certainly taught. How to speak in order to communicate effectively was certainly taught. But when Panini was asked this question, he had a very interesting answer to give. He was asked, what is upadishta? That is, what is a good rhetoric? What is well stated? What is a clean sentence? A good sentence? What is upadishta? And Panini said, well, that is the one that Shishtas speak. Then the next question was, who are Shishtas? And his answer was, those who speak Upadishta are Shishtas. Now the Bhadraloka of Bengal has a class identity, its strength, but also class interest. And school as a system of taking knowledge forward is a useful system. But the school hours, the structure of the schooling is an essential system, but the structure of school is defined by external economic realities. For instance, when the factory workers had to go to factory for those many hours, their children had to be kept engaged. And so the school hours change. What the parents could do had to be outsourced. Of course, I was taught Marathi and Gujarati in my school days. And I am infinitely grateful to my teachers. But when I look back on that experience in a very dispassionate manner, I notice that I am grateful to them for their kindness and love and their personalities, and not so much for the turn of the later they taught me, or the turn of the phrase that they taught me. I could have learned those from my elders at home, because my elders spoke language in real context, and what was taught in school was an imagined artificial context. It was a literary context. I learned many songs from my mother, and I learned many poems in school. And the poems were poems, they were literary product, not linguistic product so much. I'm not against schooling. School is a useful institution in order to produce disciplined citizens, in order to keep the state safe. We need disciplined citizens. And from the times of Plato, we were told that we must educate children so that they don't rebel against the state. And today, even more so, all over the world, when the states keep everybody under surveillance, the state will find such students very useful. I'm not against the idea of schools. Schools have empowered people. I mean, I go with Ambedkar, who said that we must educate, organize, and agitate so that everybody gets justice. In a society which is full of injustice, school is an institution useful for claiming justice for those who were denied justice. But school is not an institution necessarily useful for language preservation. That is my view after being a teacher of literature for many years.
Sure.
And after trying to study languages for many years. I hope I'm wrong, but my fear is that may not be the case.
Yeah, well, you're extremely experienced, so your statements are very valuable because of your experience and wisdom. Yeah, maybe we should think more. Sumit Yadav again asks, is there a way to determine which are the most difficult languages?
The language of love is the most difficult language.
Okay.
Because humans tend to hate, express contempt, disdain, suspicion. I think serotonin and dopamine determine that behavior, and the flow and the supply of those chemicals make humans dislike more speedily than like people. I think humans acquired language, and with that, humans acquired ability to safeguard themselves from other animals, defend themselves against the attacks by other animals. But in the process, humans learn to be cautious all the time.
Okay. Yes.
Therefore, the language of love is the most difficult. And I think every weaver in the country, whether it was Kabir or Gandhi, or a poet dreaming to be a weaver like Rabindranath Tagore, ask us to develop the language of love. But if the answer was, if the answer was expected to be name of a language, well, all languages are equally easy, and all languages are equally difficult. Indians have gone to all countries in the world and learned the local languages without a via media. They just on the block,
Yes.
in the middle of the street, they learned these languages. When Alexander came all the way to Kashmir, he did not know Dogri or Kashmiri, but he learned it. He learned it on the blade of the sword, but he learned it all the same.
So Sumit Yadav says a beautiful answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think on that note, we would like to end. You have had a great question answer session. You spoke for 40 minutes and the question answer session is for about 45 minutes or so. And we learned a lot. Thank you very much for spending time with us.